Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to this, the second of a panel on U.S.-Japan higher education. My name is Michael Mooney, and I have the honor of representing today Waseda University, as well as all the universities that are participants in the USJI program here in Washington, D.C. When I was asked to do this, I immediately, as a historian of Western thought of why we should, at this particular juncture, granted our enormous economies and political involvements, be worried about forming structures for the exchange of scholarship, the exchange of students. Why should we, of all countries, the US and Japan, being so strong in the world, do such a thing? But then as an historian, as I say, I reflected back on the fact that we are, in a sense, trying to do for the 21st century what our predecessors did in the 18th. The continent of Europe at that time was as difficult to traverse as perhaps the entire world is today. Scholarship was on the move. Sciences were being invented that had never been thought of before, and there was an enormous impulse to share that knowledge. What happened was that scholars decided that they would communicate with one another, first by letter, and then by actually making the trip from one university to the other, but even those structures were insufficient to their needs. And so they began meeting in salons in particular cities, partly in order to include women who were for the most part excluded. And then they formed royal societies, the first being in London, founded by Sir Isaac Newton in 1662. Other academies of that kind were founded, and eventually there grew up what came to be known as the Republic of Letters, a kind of republic above all republics, facilitating the exchange of information and, in due course, the invention of what we recognize to be academic journals. That was the form in its earliest formation. It was a mechanism by which they reviewed one another's work and made it known to their colleagues throughout the continent. Well, as I say, as a historian, I reflected on that because I said, what we are trying to do today, with all the innovations in technology, with all the innovations in transportation, is to come up with a set of structures that are sustainable and will allow our scholars to facilitate their work in the advancement of knowledge. So our task is, in fact, no more challenging than theirs was. In some sense, it's easier, and yet we fret about it. And we, in this case, the United States and Japan, being foremost economies in the world with great university systems, are fretting about how we can put in place structures that we can rely on and will sustain the work of the academy. The way we're going to go about this is build. First, I'm going to introduce the president of the USJI, who will review this particular theme and recount what happened at its first session in Tokyo some months ago, and in turn set the basis for what we hope to achieve today. We will then hear from our very distinguished keynote speaker, and after that we'll take some questions and answers here in this session before having lunch in an adjoining room. The Japanese ambassador will speak at that session. Then we will gather here for two panel sessions from young scholars on the one hand, and then those who are searching for these mechanisms of sustainable interaction and exchange that we are seeking. And that will, and then at the end of the day, I will wrap it up. So without further ado, I would like to call upon a man who is responsible to a large extent for this particular structure, the U.S.-Japan Research Institute, and who in his life as a dean and eventually vice president at Waseda set up the first English language curriculum within that very large and significant university, something that in turn became a model, has become a model, not only in Japan, but through Asia. My distinguished colleague, professor of law, Katsuhiko Uchida.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning. Welcome to the second US-Japan Higher Education Panel, organized by the US-Japan Research Institute and co-hosted by 7 Japanese universities, selected by Reinventing Japan Project Type B1, namely the University of Tokyo, Tokyo Institute of Technology, Nagoya University, Akita International Universities, Keio University, Ritsumeikan, Asia Pacific University, and Waseda University. Also, this panel is supported by Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology. I am Katsuichi Uchida, President of this USJI, and also Vice President of Waseda Universities. The purpose of this panel is to draw a roadmap to design a sustainable framework for enhancing academic collaboration between the United States and Japan. The first US-Japan Higher Education Panel was held in April this year. We have discussed several ways to stimulate student mobilities between the United States and Japan. And there are many prominent speakers, both from Japan and the United States, and inspired by various ideas exchanged during the April panel on how to increase the US-Japan student and the researchers' mobilities. This time, we are here to propose more concrete measures to design and implement a sustainable framework to facilitate active academic exchange among the United States and Japan. Today's panels consist of 5 different parts. First, we'll receive a keynote speech from George Packard, distinguished scholars on US-Japan relationship. Secondly, we'll have a luncheon speech from His Excellency Mr. Ichiro Fujisaki, Japanese ambassador to the United States, on the topics of Japan's challenge and strengths. Then, during the afternoon, we'll have 2 panel discussions. The first part will be panel discussion on practical and sustainable measures or proposal to facilitate active academic exchange. There will be 4 speakers, representatives from 3 universities: Professor Michael Hartford, the University of Tokyo, Dr. Yasuma Saito, Nagoya University, and Vice President Mark Williams, Akita International Universities. These universities are selected for Reinventing Japan project, and Dr. Sheila Smith, distinguished scholars on US-Japan relations, and senior fellows, Council on Foreign Affairs. After that, there will be a panel discussion by young Japanese professors currently teaching and researching at university and research institute in the United States. Dr. Yoko Goto Butler, Associate Professor, University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Kohei Honma, Visiting Fellow, National Institute of Health. Dr. Hiromi Ono, Visiting Scholars, UCLA, California Center for Population Research. And Dr. Yuki Tsutsumi, Senior Associate, the Henry Simpson Center. They'll discuss their experience to enter the U.S. academic communities and several issues they face in their career development. Finally, in the evening, we'll have social networking receptions. As I have explained, we have abundant programs today, so I hope many people will be able to participate as many events as possible. I'm sure today's event will produce fruitful result and become a solid foundation of the US-Japan collaboration in higher education sectors. We hope to continue similar events next year as well. And thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Uchida. And now it's time to hear from our very distinguished keynoter, a man who knows a great deal about the subject that we are addressing today, both because of his lifelong involvement in U.S.-Japan relations, but also because he is a man who himself in his professional life, particularly at Johns Hopkins University, has built structures that actually connect countries. As a very young PhD, he was selected to assist Ambassador Reischauer in Tokyo, and that began a career that has extended for many years in academia as well as in journalism, both print journalism. Many of you, I'm sure, have read his items in various publications, as well as on the media. For many, many years, he was the dean of the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies down the road here. And in that capacity, as I say, actually established several institutions that have become household words almost in U.S.-Asian relations. One, the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies, and the other, the Hopkins Nanjing Center in China. He also established the SAIS Review while he was dean, and in all of these manners managed to pull together scholars from across the United States and Japan in very fruitful collaborations. He is now, and has been since 1998, the head of one of the most significant institutions that facilitates U.S.-Japan, namely the United States-Japan Foundation. Without further ado, I introduce George Packard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mooney, for that warm and generous introduction. And Vice President Uchida, Ino-sensei, distinguished panelists and scholars and researchers and educators who are assembled here this week to address one of the most critical problems facing our two nations. It's a great honor for me to be with you today, and I hope to learn more from you than I can possibly tell you about the topic that we are all. May I close that? Thank you. I am the Model T version of the Packard. I do not use a I do not use a computer to speak. Maybe I should. I think the outcome of your deliberations here will go far toward determining not only the future of the U.S.-Japan relationship, but I would also say the future of our two countries in the Asia-Pacific region. I feel very comfortable in participating in any event that has a Waseda sponsorship of any sort. I have a very special feeling of fondness toward your university, Professor Uchida. Going back to December 1963, when I was working, as has been mentioned, as special assistant, or I should say kabanmochi, to Ambassador Edwin Reischauer in Tokyo. And I was charged with managing his relationships with students and universities and intellectuals. And at that time, you'll remember this is less than a month after the assassination of President Kennedy, a group of Waseda students who were a kind of a club that admired Kennedy very much came to the embassy and asked if we would join them in a memorial service honoring the late president, who had been assassinated less than a month earlier. Ambassador Reischauer instantly agreed and assigned me to work with students to arrange for a very large gathering in Okumakodo, which we did. And it turned out to be a very moving and memorable event, as the youthful Kennedy had clearly touched a chord of admiration and sympathy among Waseda students. They, of course, were aware of the tumultuous reception given to Attorney General Robert Kennedy earlier in February 1962, when many left-wing students tried to disrupt the event and shout him down. Some of your memories may go back that far. And created headlines around the world. The memorial service for these students was kind of a redemptive and satisfying reprise to an earlier event. However, just a month later, now January '64, Robert Kennedy again shows up in Tokyo, ostensibly to negotiate a deal with President Sukarno of Indonesia. But in fact, as I now realize, it was the first step in his quest for the White House. Kennedy was determined to go again to Waseda, hoping to bolster his image by standing up to rowdy communists and holding his ground. That's how Nixon got elected, and Kennedy knew that, and he wanted to have a protest, and he wanted to look brave on television. But when we learned of his desire to visit Waseda just about 48 hours before the appointed day, Ambassador Reischauer sent me to speak with President Ohama Nobumoto to see if such a visit could be arranged. President Ohama actually said no. He did not want to risk embarrassing the university again if any rude acts might be committed against Robert Kennedy by the students. I came back, and I never will forget riding in a big black limousine with Reischauer and Kennedy in the back seat, and I was up in a little jump seat, and I said that the trip to Waseda would not be possible. President Ohama said no. And I will never forget the language used by Robert Kennedy when he heard this. And he said, "I have arranged hundreds of student meetings for my brother, and if you can't do that, we'll get somebody who can." So we got to our destination, and I turned to Reischauer, and I said, "What do I do now?" And he said, "Go back and speak to President Ohama and see if you can reason with him." And I did, and we did. And so President Ohama thankfully understood the situation, and so he said yes. So I worked with student leaders to make sure that only Waseda students, no outsiders, entered into Okuma Hall that day. We used the weightlifting club, actually, the biggest schools, to stand by the door and look at IDs. So on January 18th, 1964, Robert Kennedy spoke to a hall packed with 2,000 students and 5,000 more standing outside in the rain. The event was mostly peaceful, and the media portrayed it as a triumph for Kennedy. But I came to understand later that Kennedy really was disappointed. He hoped for turmoil, and he didn't get it. And Ed Reischauer later told me that he felt his job was on the line. If things had gone badly, he would have been out as ambassador, and of course, therefore, so was mine. So I am ever grateful to those Waseda students and President Ohama for their success in hosting Robert and Ethel Kennedy. Today you are addressing the challenge of designing and implementing a sustainable framework to facilitate academic exchanges among American and Japanese universities and institutions. I understand that you will be seeking concrete proposals, such as establishing a Japanese equivalent of the Rhodes Scholars Program or the Fulbright Program, or to create a new version of the JET program at the postdoctoral level to conduct research activities while teaching Japanese or content classes to start an academic career, to create double degree programs between US and Japanese universities, and to establish mid-career young professional exchange programs between the US and Japanese government offices and private universities. I cannot imagine a more important agenda and one that will so affect our two nations' future. And I applaud you for each of these ideas. They have been discussed for many years, as you know, but implementation has been slow or fragmentary. So as you deliberate today and in the future, please let me offer just a few insights or thoughts or maybe even guideposts that might inform the discussions. The first, of course, is money, funding. Unless and until a permanent endowment of some sort can be created, long-term exchanges will rest on shaky ground and will fail to attract the finest students and scholars. Even the Fulbright program today must rely on US congressional support each year for its survival. So, unless we can find a new Cecil Rhodes, perhaps a billionaire who believes deeply in educational exchange between our two nations, and I don't discount that as a possibility, we will have to rely on government funding. And given the deficits today that both our nations face, this will not be an easy task. I note, however, that a report in Nikkei on September 6th, 4 days ago, that the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology will increase its financial aid to some 10,300 university and graduate students for study overseas in order to change the so-called inward-looking tendencies of Japanese students. But it is still alarming that there has been a decrease of 28% between 2004 and 2009 in Japanese students studying abroad. Japan is now 7th among nations sending students to study in the US, and the number continues to decline, while Chinese and Indian and Korean students continue to increase. As educators, we need to make the case that educational exchanges are vital, not just to maintain the vibrancy of our alliance and partnership in the Asia-Pacific region, but because we are the two nations whose values are most closely aligned. Our shared belief in the rule of law, in human dignity, in freedom of the seas, in democracy, human rights, is a precious legacy that we cannot take for granted. No other nations in the region are as committed as the US and Japan to these values. And in order to keep them alive and relevant, we need to create and maintain strong bonds between our institutions of higher learning and to refresh these ideals for each new generation. And then there's the challenge of language and cultural distance. Although we have made great progress in teaching English in Japan and Japanese in America, we still have a very long way to go. It sounds arrogant for any American, including this one, to lecture Japanese on why they should improve English language teaching in Japan. But I truly believe, along with Edwin O. Reischauer, that Japan's future as an international leader depends on its developing a much stronger capacity for expressing its own ideals and explaining its own rich culture to the outside world. As American educators, we need to look at ourselves as well. And we need to ask ourselves why our country is less attractive to Japanese students than in the past. Yes, of course, China, Korea, and India are all rapidly rising economies and magnets for graduate students. They like to go where the money is or where the trouble is, and there's both in those countries. But shouldn't we also worry as Americans about our own corrupt political system, the role of money that we're seeing right now in the presidential election, and our military-industrial complex, and the endless appetite of our Pentagon for money? So part of the solution, while we Americans lecture Japan about their English, we should be lecturing ourselves about our political system right now. I know that the events of March 11 and afterwards have created, both within Japan and in the outside world, a feeling that Japan may be destined to be mired in its own economic and energy problems for years to come. But I disagree with the gloomy prognosis. The example, for this reason, the example of Japanese resilience, of working harmoniously together in the face of danger and disaster, were truly amazing and impressive to Americans who watched the situation. I've heard many comments here in Washington about how Japan handled this tragedy far better than we could have handled a similar tragedy in Washington or New York or California or New England. So we should take advantage of this silver lining, or Kochu no Saiwai, and incorporate it in what we teach the next generation of students. Japan still has much to teach the rest of the world, and it needs to raise its voice to a new level. Please let me offer just a few other thoughts based on my experience as a graduate student in Japan from 1960 to 62. I was lucky enough to receive a Ford Foundation Foreign Area Studies grant to pursue my doctoral research in Tokyo. That series of grants has ended now, but it might be worth studying to see about its strengths and weaknesses as you deliberate the future. This was a time, I was there just after the security treaty protests of June 1960, And I was extremely lucky to have the International House, the Kokusai Bunka Kaikan, with its excellent library, wide contacts in academic circles, and central location for fellow scholars, both Japanese and American, with whom to share ideas in a kind of running Benkyo-kai for an entire year. Most of all, I was lucky to be introduced to superb mentors who generously shared their time and wisdom as I tried to understand the sources of protest in the Ampo Hantai Undo. These included Professors Ishida Takeshi of Todai, Professor Eto Shinkichi of Todai, and later Professor Inoki Masamichi, Professor Honma Nagayo. These great scholars opened doors for me and directed my research to important documents, raised the right questions, and encouraged me to bounce ideas off of them. So I mention this experience because as you deliberate any possible exchange programs for doctoral research, I would urge you to make this kind of mentoring a central aspect of any such program. Secondly, I would hope if you think about graduate study in the other country, you would deliberately allow free time for exploration and travel within the target country. That was the beauty of the Ford Foundation plan that I was so lucky to be part of. There was a time in the fall of 1960 when I put a knapsack on my back and went up to Akita Prefecture and walked from Akita to Aomori to Iwate. And spent the night wherever I could. Sometimes I would stop. It was the rice harvest time, and I would stop and join. I would be invited to join in harvesting rice, and then the family would invite me to come in and say, "Where are you spending the night?" And I said, "I don't know." They said, "Be here." They were marvelously hospitable. I got the first hot tub of the bath, and I got to see an aspect of Japan that I never could have seen in Tokyo or in a research library. I will never forget one particular experience as I came around Aomori-ken. I walked into the little tiny town of Hachinoe, and I walked to this port, and I saw a group of fishermen, ikabune, the squid boats, getting ready to go out fishing. And the captain just voluntarily said, "How would you like to come with us?" And I said, "I would love to." I thought we'd go out for an hour and come back with a bunch of squid. No. A little fleet of 12 squid boats went out about 20 miles to the ocean. Now it's dark, and they turned on these powerful lights. You've all seen that, I'm sure. And the squid rise to the surface and are reeled in on hooks into the boat. And pretty soon we are standing up to our knees in squid, live. And all of a sudden, the fisherman cries out, "Hey, we have a winner here, a white one, sort of an albino kind of squid." And so this is very special. So they said to me, "You get the first bite." Right there. And the ship is going like this. Anyway, I listened to those fishermen talk all night, particularly about their feelings about Russians. Every one of them knew somebody or had a relative who had been picked up by a Russian boat and held for a while. Russia was not popular in Aomori-ken at this time. But that kind of experience made me not at all surprised when I read about what happened in Iwate Prefecture after March 11th of last year, the ability to work together. These fishermen were not out there competing with each other. They were working together to produce a product. They would bring it in, they would share the profits, and it showed me how communal activity can be more productive than cutthroat competition. In a larger way, I think it's a lesson that Japan can teach the rest of the world. Thirdly, I would emphasize the classroom experience for graduate students going abroad, both teaching and learning. I was lucky enough to take a lecture course by Professor Maruyama Masao. I understood a little bit of it, but I got to discuss his lectures with other students, and it left an indelible impression. So as you design a research program, I think you should make sure that the researcher cannot just sit in a carrel or a study area and do his own thinking and writing. He should or she should be out in the classroom, both teaching and learning. Fourth, I believe the graduate students studying abroad should be organized into Benkyokai on a regular basis. It is very easy for graduate researchers to hide and work only on their own project, but to force them into discussion groups with others is a very healthy exercise, and it forces them to test out their ideas and sound out scholars on their research. Finally, I believe that we should not overlook the problem of leadership in both our countries. As you know, it's a hot topic in the political world. Why has Japan had 6 prime ministers in 6 years? It's a hot topic right here, right now, as we go through congressional and presidential elections. I think there's a general worry, in America at least, that somehow we are not producing leaders like Senator Fulbright or Senator Mansfield or some of the other giants who ran the political world in Washington. And I don't know if that's true in Japan as well. But the US-Japan Foundation is trying to tackle a piece of that problem by running a US-Japan leadership program, now in its 13th year. And I have had the privilege of seeing each year, each summer, 20 Americans and 20 Japanese chosen from all fields, including academic field, to get together for a week, 1 year in Seattle, the next year in Kyoto, to exchange ideas on a variety of topics. And it has convinced me that our two countries do not lack leaders, but we are not creating opportunities for them soon enough in their careers to express themselves and to move up through the ranks. It is discouraging to read that Japanese entrepreneurs who have a good idea in this new world that we live in, the internet, need to go to Silicon Valley in California to plant their ideas and create a corporation. So I think that we need to, and I think this is coming from an older guy in both countries, but maybe in Confucian Japan particularly, the older generation needs to be more welcoming of younger leaders and bring them along and foster them and create opportunities for them, because they are the. Well, in conclusion, please let me salute you for tackling these tough problems and to wish for your success as this conference goes forward. We are all on the same team when it comes for the hopes and dreams for our children and grandchildren's future, a future which rests on sound education. And you may remember the famous statement by Aldous Huxley, who said that civilization is a race between education and disaster. And it is a race that we must win. Thank you very much.
Would you take some questions?
Sure. I'm sure your questions will be better than my answers, but I would welcome.
Please, if anyone wants to ask a question, if you will come to that microphone, we have about 10 minutes.
Hi, my name is Oka. I'm with Alcorata. I think you observed Japanese students for quite a long time. And in your observation, what are the changes that you notice? How the Japanese young people changed when Kennedy was still alive up until today? Could you share your view on that?
Thank you very much. The difference in Japanese students today. I think that they are not so different from American students. I tend to see them at the graduate school level, and as has been mentioned, I teach at Columbia, and so the students I meet are self-selected as interested in international affairs. I think that one difference perhaps is the willingness of these Japanese students that I see, the cohort at Columbia, willingness to ask questions and to argue back against the sensei. 20 years ago at SAIS, when I met Japanese students, they tended to be quiet, they did their homework, but they didn't speak up in class unless you called on them, and even then they were a little bit uneasy about speaking up. Today I find them refreshingly open and willing to share their views. And as I say, these are the ones who have opted to come to Columbia, let's say. And so by definition they are probably going to be more outspoken. But I suggest that might be a trend in the students generally. That's the upside. The downside might be that I'm not sure Japanese students know much about recent history. My course is called From Pearl Harbor to the Present, and several of them are not quite sure who was fighting whom at Pearl Harbor. So we spend a couple of hours on that issue and why. And you know, the more I teach about that, the more I think it's not so cut and dried as to why. But anyway, history seems to stop around the 1920s for Japan, and then picks up in the post-war period. One hopes that there will be more attention to causes of war in order to avoid the next one. Sir.
Steve Winters, local researcher. We recently got a report on the third edition of the so-called Armitage Nye report on Japanese U.S. relations, and Richard Armitage has made a statement that Japan is facing a major decision. Are they going to remain, in his terms, a first-tier nation, or are they going to lapse into sort of the second tier of nations? What's your view on the decisions facing Japan and the role of education in answering that question?
Thank you very much. I'm not a tier person. I do not believe in dividing nations into tiers. And secondly, whatever Mr. Armitage thinks, Japan is and will remain a major force in the world. Of course there are economic problems and energy problems and so forth, but that culture is too rich and too important, and the Japanese aesthetic and historical role cannot be dismissed by Mr. Armitage or Mr. Nye in any report. I thought that the nuclear power industry would be thrilled with that report, and having read it, Armitage is telling the Japanese they must continue to have nuclear power. I don't know why an American should be telling Japanese what they need to do. They're quite capable, they have been over the centuries, of deciding on their own fate, and so although I haven't read the article as carefully as I should, I'm still surprised that we are lecturing the Japanese on their own future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Richard Leno's professor of entrepreneurship at American University, and I was a visiting professor at Ritsumeikan in Japan, where I tried to teach entrepreneurship. Lovely students, not driving burn to create their own business. And you talked about the wonders of Japanese cooperation, or you can look inside Toyota. Amazing, amazing knowledge sharing, knowledge creation.
Right.
It doesn't breed, though, the fierce independence that leads people to split off on their own. So I'm torn. You know, I appreciate the wonders of Japanese society, but I also see that it dampers. I mean, I talk with Japanese trading company people from different countries, and they always feel liberated operating in other countries, and they come back home to Japan and they have to pay attention to their seniors.
Right.
So where do you see the economic revival in Japan? Are you with the ambassador, American ambassador now, that believes that entrepreneurship is the answer, or does there have to be some variation that better fits Japanese culture?
Well, that's a very good question. I would say it wasn't ever thus. There have been amazing entrepreneurs in Japan, going back to Shibusawa Eiichi. You know, that was one of Reischauer's great hero symbols of entrepreneurship. In the post-war period, Mr. Honda, Mr. Morita of Sony, Panasonic, you know, these were started by bold, brave entrepreneurs who put their money where their mouth was and created empires of great substance. So to say that Japan has never had entrepreneurs is wrong. To ask why they don't seem to be coming forward now is the right question, I think. And I guess my answer, again, speaking for the older generation, is we older guys are too slow to step aside and encourage this kind of entrepreneurship. It really, it's a tragedy to see people waiting until they're 60 or 65 to become CEOs. And so my message to my fellow elderly Japanese bosses is, you know, stand back. You've got great talent. It's not that you don't have the talent. It's not that they don't desire to move forward. They're just a little overwhelmed by your prestige and too much impressed by the examples of the past success. They need to engage in what Schumpeter called creative destruction. And if a few eggs get broken to make the new omelet, that's what has to happen. You're far better qualified to answer that your own question, though, than I am, because entrepreneurship is a big subject.
My name is Omura, coming from Kyushu University. Thank you very much for your very impressive and heartwarming presentation. Because I was born in 1960 in Akita Prefecture.
Akita, okay.
Yes. And now I'm working in the Kyushu University in charge of international affairs. As you may already know that now in Japan, most of all university is trying to produce the human resources who can work in global society. However, we are now facing some problems like limit of the budget or limit of human resources as well. Then could you kindly advise to the Japanese universities how to produce or promote more effective and efficient way to make global human resources in comparison of the Japanese university situation in like 1960 and present. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That is a huge question. Again, Japan does not lack for amazing international leaders in various fields. I happen to have been a fellow PhD student with Ogata Sadako-san back when we were both doing our theses. She actually honored me by saying, would I read her thesis, which was being written for University of California, to correct the English. And I read it, and I found out her English is far better than mine. I couldn't correct it. But current head of the International Atomic Energy Association, Mr. Amano, there are examples of great Japanese international civil servants and so forth. How can we develop more of them? It starts, of course, with language. It does. Without the English language ability, it is very hard for a Japanese leader to make any impression. They may know all the right answers. They may have detailed technical knowledge, but if they can't express themselves in an international forum, say in the United Nations or elsewhere, it's a non-starter. I do find Japanese in some ways far more internationally oriented than Americans at the graduate student level. There is a support level for the United Nations in Japan, which is higher, I believe, according to every poll, than it is in America. There is evidence that the Japanese education system develops far more international outlooks than the American. There is one number that I must share with you now about weighing the two primary education and secondary education systems. How many Japanese accept the idea of the theory of evolution. A Gallup poll showed that 78% of Japanese accept that theory in one form or another. How many Americans accept the theory of evolution? 38%, okay? Well under half of Americans. So in terms of universal knowledge, I would not be so critical of Japanese education. But in terms of stepping forward and assuming leadership of international organizations, much remains to be done. It starts with language, but it also requires, I think, encouragement from the Japanese government, and certainly you all as educators can do a great deal to foster this spirit that the world is becoming smaller, and that unless we develop these institutions, we are doomed to more of the same. So it's a great question.
One more.
Hello, I am Erin Robertson, and I'm a graduate student at American University, and I recently returned from the JET program. And so my question is about the JET program. What sorts of improvements do you think can be made to the initiative in the JET program to better facilitate learning from the primary level, which often leads to higher education and that level as well?
I salute you for being a JET. I think the JET program is the single most effective foreign policy that Japan has today. I cringe when I read that people are, as they try to cut budgets, are trying to cut back the JET program. I happen to have work with a staff of 6 people in New York, and 2 of them have been JETs. You say former JETs, or you say JETs? Like, you don't say former Marines, right? You say, so I guess I'll say JETs. They have been 2 of the most outstanding students I have ever, and workers that I've ever met. One of them had no experience in Japan. She was a Northwestern University drama major and got sent to Iwate Prefecture and came back and became absolutely the most valuable colleague I've ever had. When she got married and moved to Chicago, she tapped another JET whom she knew in Iwate, and now that person works with me, and they have a sense of Japan that from the classroom, from living in the village, from eating the food, from living alongside their Japanese colleagues, that is just invaluable, and they are committed now to the U.S.-Japan relationship. And I don't know in your case, but I sense that you may also have a commitment in that direction. So I think it's marvelous, and if I could write the ticket, I would triple or quadruple the JET program, send that many more people, and I would start a counterpart JET program, bringing Japanese here to teach Japanese in American schools and also to perform other educational functions. It's a great, great program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Packard. That was witty, wise, and very passionate, and will provide a great platform. We will now adjourn for dinner and some remarks, for lunch, and some remarks from the ambassador, and then reconvene here for the afternoon panels. I think at 1:45, is that for this afternoon? 1:45. Next door. Thank you very much for your